on or off. I am also going to include the Jedi Office YouTube channel where this recording can also be found after today's conversation. Just want to give everyone a reminder that we also encourage engagement in the chat. And of course, there will be an opportunity to have a Q&A with Dr. Kumar. So if you feel more comfortable waiting then, please feel free to wait. And if you don't, if you have questions, Marisha, Ermi, and I will look out for those questions and save them towards the end of the conversation. So before we get started, just want to take a moment to pause and remember that this opportunity for us to come together also is an opportunity for us to remember Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is an annual observance on November 20th that honors the memory of transgender people whose lives were lost in act of anti-transgender violence. You can read more about this and we'll add a link to the chat for you to figure out how you can get involved in your community and of course, how you can better support students, faculty, and staff and people in your own communities as well. And so we'll share a link if you want to learn more about Transgender Day of Remembrance. We also know that in Boulder, there's a big event that happens that celebrates Transgender Day of Remembrance. And we hope that you find some time to go and be in community with people in this special day and also Day of Remembrance. And so for today's conversation, just want to thank you all. This event is hosted by the Office of Justice, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion. My name is Dr. Patricia Gonzalez. You are all welcome to call me Patricia. I use the pronoun she, her, ella. And for today's conversation, we invite you to think about and reflect on the challenges that trans and gender non-conforming, conforming and non-binary faculty, staff, and students face in higher education institutions in the state of Colorado. This conversation really brings us to current context where trans rights, reproductive rights, and affirmative action are being systematically dismantled. It is imperative that we approach these challenges with an intersectional lens. This workshop also aims to generate strategies on how to design policies, strengthen allyship, and build capacity for a more equitable, gender-just environment in higher education. And so before we get started, we're going to introduce our first poll. Marisha is going to go ahead and put that poll for you all to take. And we just invite you all to take a few minutes to answer the questions. So the first question is asking, how would you rate your understanding of the challenges trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming populations in higher education on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being I know nothing, 5 being I know everything? Okay. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. All right. So it looks like 100% of the participants or most of the participants have answered the question. And so towards the end of our conversation, we will also do another poll to see how you feel after today's conversation of your knowledge when it comes to supporting trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming populations. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Marisha, who is going to talk about the results, but also do a land acknowledgement.
Urmi is actually going to be doing our land acknowledgement today. Yes. So I'm going to pass it over to Urmi, who is our program coordinator in the Office for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion.
Thank you, Marisha. Thank you, Urmi.
Thank you. So we invite you all to take a moment to reflect on your relationship to this land of Boulder and our relationship to local Indigenous communities as we are guided by the university's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state and in stewardship to land before the establishment of the state into this present moment. CU Boulder humbly acknowledges that it is located on the traditional and current homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native nations and communities. The violent, forced removal of Native people from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. These histories have brought us to this present moment wherein the University of Colorado Boulder is determined to commit to improving and enhancing relationships with Indigenous communities and issues locally and globally. So we'll be doing this in 3 ways. 1, recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work. educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, and consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with Native communities to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. So if you'd like to continue your education about these issues, please take a look at the chat. Marisha is going to put a few links there. And she has. Thanks, Marisha.
Thank you so much, Urmi.
Yeah.
So my name is Marisha Lopez. I am the Program Manager for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the College of Arts and Sciences. And I have the pleasure of introducing you all to Dr. Rushaan Kumar, Assistant Professor of Feminist and Gender Studies at Colorado College. He is a founding director of the Colorado Springs LGBTQ+ Oral History Project and a senior fellow at the Center for Applied Transgender Studies. And in the chat, I will put a link to a longer bio and then also a link to the Colorado Springs LGBTQ+ Oral History Project. So with that, welcome Dr. Rushaan Kumar.
Thank you, Marisha, for that introduction. I'll go ahead and jump into my little PowerPoint here. I want to start with, well, as soon as I can figure out how to make this work. All right, so hi, everyone. Thank you to the Jedi team. I love that name. Particularly Dr. Patricia Gonzalez and Marisha Lopez for inviting me today and organizing this event. It's really a pleasure to meet you all, even virtually. I come to you today. Sorry, I really don't know how to work this. I apologize. I'm so sorry. I want to start by saying that I come to you today from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples, also known as Colorado Springs. And I want to acknowledge that we are gathering at a time when a US-backed genocide is being carried out against the people of Palestine, including Palestinian queer and trans people. As we think together today about creating trans-affirming universities, I would like to also encourage us to think about the ways in which we and our universities are complicit with our dollars, often our discourse and our silence, and in multiple other ways, in the ongoing subjugation and deaths of trans and cisgender people in Palestine and elsewhere. To me, creating gender-just universities in Colorado means that we see trans liberation here as deeply connected to the freedom and decolonization of Palestine, of Kashmir, and other militarized zones in the world. With that, I would like to start off by sort of providing a framework within which I would like us to think about creating trans-affirming universities in Colorado. I have to say that this is not quite my area of expertise or research, so I come to you today without my professor hat on and with my experiential hat on. But I would like to, so I'm going to speak from some of the struggles that I've sort of experienced in higher education as a grad student and now as faculty. But of course, my vision for how we might, dismantle our oppression and change the current state of higher ed vis-a-vis trans folks is guided by certain principles, which I would like to lay out very quickly for you. So the first thing is that, of course, it is important for us to think intersectionally. And of course, we've heard this word a lot, but I would like to sort of go over what my sort of understanding of this term is and how it applies to trans folks, right? So thinking intersectionally to me means thinking across difference and multiple structures of oppression, such as race, class, gender, ability, citizenship, and so on, right? But it also means that we think about intersectionality as not only to do with oppressed identities and how to cater to the needs of folks who are perhaps trans, but also of color, also disabled, so on and so forth, right? But also think about how power and domination and oppression is multiply administered and disseminated through our institutions, right? So I would like to move from a way of thinking about intersectionality as something to do with identities to something to do with systems that actually we all participate in and can construct and then reconstruct, right, and change in order to think about how those institutions and those structures are playing out in trans people's lives. Another thing that I want us to sort of remember is that to think intersectionally, right, means that the demarginalization of oppressed people requires a complex and nuanced understanding of structures of oppression, right? So yes, we want to acknowledge that it is it's complex, right? And there is richness to this conversation. There are layers to it that we want to get into, right? But we want to stay away from weaponizing this complexity, right, against those against those who are impacted, right, by these systems, by deeming it too complicated and thereby by deeming it unapproachable, right? So if we want to think of ourselves as allies to trans folks, right, we have to empower ourselves also to take action, to jump into the complexity, to understand it, to take accountability, and to act from there, right? We know how discourses of an issue being too complicated are being used way too often, especially in the current context with Palestine, right? To not jump into an issue, to stay silent, to stay inactive, right? So the first step to allyship is to sort of demystify, right, for ourselves, what it means to think about issues that may not belong or may not, we may not think are directly impacting us, right? The second sort of part of this framework that I would love for us to keep in mind, right, is that we want to approach trans-affirming universities through the lens of reform as well as liberation, right? Meaning that we can think in ways, right, in nuanced ways, how to fix and fine-tune the existing systems that we have, right, while also acknowledging that some of what we have in terms of existing systems don't work, and maybe we need to rethink those radically in order to achieve liberation, right? So to sort of think on both registers at the same time, reform and liberation, right? So fixing and fine-tuning existing systems, but then also moving from a reaction-based, moving from reaction-based actions to a preventative and a preemptive approach, right? So to use Black trans abolitionist Tourmaline's words, right? We want to prefigure our universities for trans liberation. We want to act in anticipation of distress, of marginalization, and so on and so forth, rather than try to come up with solutions when a crisis has occurred and quick fix it and move on, right? We want to also think then simultaneously about short-term goals as well as long-term visioning, right? And this requires not only creative visioning, but also a certain amount of courage and capacity building that hopefully we can get into today as well, right? So thinking simultaneously about both types of goals. And lastly here, but very importantly, again, to center a Black abolitionist scholar and activist who many of us might know about, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, what she calls guard duties, right? So how can we think about moving away from guard duties, right? Meaning shifting away from an institutional culture of paranoia and of suspicion towards trans people, especially trans people of color, right? That treat us like fraudsters to guard and protect the university from, or at the very least as burdens, right? And instead to aggressively and avowedly move towards a position of support and service providing, right? So that trans people can thrive. So with that in mind, I would just like to give us a couple seconds if we could come up together, if we can identify, right, together, what are some of these guard duties, quote unquote, right, that we are all sort of pulled into from our various sort of positions and positionalities at the university, ways in which we are asked to put the interest of the university, its reputation, right, ideas around security, so on and so forth, first, before the sort of well-being of trans folks, especially trans folks of color. So if you could just use the chat for like a quick thought process together. Yes, bathroom segregation. Absolutely. So can we unpack that? What about gender neutral bathrooms makes us into guards?
Just the conversation, the limited conversations that I've been around, I mean, it makes it seem like there's just no way through it, that there's all these policies in place at the state level, that sort of make me feel like we have no way to move forward. Like I'm just supposed to guard these policies.
Yes, absolutely. To guard and defend the policies, and also guard and defend the actual space by calling out trans people who apparently do not fit or do not belong in a particular space. Right? Absolutely. Healthcare, yeah, gatekeeping through health insurance, right? Absolutely. I've seen, HR folks struggle with that at my own institution, right? Wanting to support trans people, but being bound by these policies and then becoming the face of these policies, right? Absolutely. Refusal to reimagine and reconfigure curriculum. Yes, thank you for saying that. Absolutely. We are, as professors, often incentivized to guard particular kinds of canons, right? Particular kinds of set curriculum that is considered acceptable or otherwise. Yes, name changes in our various systems. Amazing. Requirement of documentation for some of our academic petitions. Okay, yeah. Yes, residence hall and housing. Absolutely. Deciding who gets to enter buildings at what time, right? And ensuring proper use of our little ID cards, all of those sorts of things. Amazing. So, I mean, yes, we seem to have a really great sense of all of these ways in which we need not be in the security industry, right? In order to participate and have to become the faces of a certain kind of guard duty, a certain kind of safekeeping of the university against the interests and the well-being of trans folks, right? So how can we divest from this and think through an abolitionist lens, right? To think about how trans folks can thrive within universities, right? So with that, I want to just as soon as I can figure out how to get this chat box away from me. Any suggestions? Okay, I figured it out. Sorry. I apologize. I'm really bad with technology and especially PowerPoint, so please bear with me. But okay, so I would like to get to some of the challenges that I've identified that trans folks go through. in higher ed, and then come back later to some of this framework and how we can sort of use it to think about how to frame our actions. So let's talk about a little bit about the challenges that are confronting us in this moment. I've organized these challenges as I see them in 3 tiers, right? The first is at the level of law and policy. The second is at the institutional level, and the third is the everyday lived reality that trans people are trying to navigate, right? So as you all might already know, in 2023 alone, 586 anti-trans bills have been introduced in the country, out of which currently 367 are still active. And all of those seek to block trans people from receiving basic healthcare, education, legal recognition, and the right to publicly exist even. We also know of the recent overturning of Roe v. Wade, and therefore the dismantling of reproductive rights, right? And we have, I'm sure, heard about the dismantling of affirmative action. But what do these sort of like national level, right, like laws and policies mean for us in Colorado? What this means for the state of Colorado, and therefore universities in Colorado, is that people, right, students, staff, faculty, will be seeking to relocate to Colorado from other places, right? Because Colorado is positioning itself as a safe haven, right, for reproductive rights, for trans rights, and even for affirmative action, from what I've read. CU Boulder, president and chancellors articulate, and so on. So with that, the chances of trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary people, especially, trans folks of color, right, increasing on Colorado campuses, right, is quite high. So that is something to remember for us, right? The other thing that this sort of like higher level sort of thing, these developments mean, is that especially the dismantling of affirmative action, right, that also means that in the long term, I mean, in the short to long term, right, the chances of queer, trans, gender nonconforming, and non-binary people of color, their chances of receiving specialized services, especially medical care, from professionals from minoritized communities is also under threat, right? Because if we are not recruiting and admitting according to, with affirmative action in mind, we're also not graduating folks who are then gaining expertise and therefore providing services. So we have very soon, I mean, already Colorado is, we know that there is a dearth of service providers, professionals who are of color, right? This is a constant conversation among queer and trans folks of color, how to find folks who are quote unquote culturally competent and so on and so forth. But we can expect that to actually worsen, right, over time. So how do we sort of think through that, right? At the institutional level, the challenges are also aplenty, right? Support, for instance, across the university feels fragmented oftentimes, right, along hierarchies with very little buy-in from upper administration, right? This is something that we see over and over again at a liberal arts institution like my own, and at larger universities as well, that there might be departmental support, right? There might be, offices, right? Support from localized sort of, administrative units, such as JEDI, for instance, right? But that doesn't mean that that there's a lot of cross-pollination of ideas happening, right? It doesn't mean that the folks who are actually in decision-making roles are intervening in a timely fashion, right? And are remaking our policies and so on and so forth. So fragmented support is a big one, right? Second, there's a lot of trans-friendly discourse, especially among, within DEI conversations and within such offices, right? But also in programs that, such as mine, right? Feminist and gender studies, ethnic studies, so on and so forth, right? So one can feel sometimes that there's, or even, statements issued by presidents, chancellors, so on and so forth, that there is a lot of positive discourse, a lot of, positive feeling around, trans folks and trans identities. But there is little action that follows through, right? This is a problem that we encounter over and over again. And hopefully at the end of this workshop, we'll have a few ideas about how to change, this sort of discourse or conversation into action, right? Then there is a problem of a lack of data, right? There is a lack of data generated on LGBTQ folks on campuses. So we do not know how to channel and to who to channel our resources, right? Who are we able to recruit and who are we able to retain? Right? We don't have retention data about, at the grad level, at the undergrad level, faculty, etc. right? At every level. So how to disseminate resources, how to disseminate information, who are we even catering to, right? Who is requiring our services? How do those folks then get together and form communities, right? That data can be used in so many different ways to empower us, but it is right now not being generated enough, right? If at all. So a lack of data is a big problem, right? And then we often individualize problems, right? And their solutions, meaning that we think of problems as pertaining to a particular individual, right, who's coming to us for help. We come up with some quick solutions to relieve them of whatever hurdle they're encountering, right? And then the tendency is often to move on rather than thinking about it as a problem that needs to be solved for everybody to be able to, right, navigate spaces, right? Whether it's a bathroom issue or whatever, or a curriculum issue, right? Either way. So this sort of minimizing of problems and solutions, right, to an individual level rather than a systemic level is a problem that I've seen across institutions and something that we want to keep in mind, right? And then there is the problems on the everyday level that trans people face in just navigating everyday life, right? So we know, and this list is by no means exhausting, right? But names and pronouns, right? Getting dead name, getting misgendered, right? All of the time while receiving services, right? Gendered and gender segregated bathrooms. We have talked about that already in the chat a little bit, right? Navigating healthcare is a major one, despite some universities and their health program, health insurance programs being quite robust. There's still the problem of understanding all of, the rules and their exceptions and how they apply to trans folks, right? And the information tends to be pretty scattered. So healthcare and navigating that is important. Safety, right? Safety concerns around, of course, bathroom policing, as we tend to do. So, physical safety, housing, some folks mentioned residential halls, so on and so forth. But also encountering transphobia, racism in our curriculum, right? In classrooms and so on and so forth. So safety is one. Food and housing, right, is a huge problem that only gets compounded depending on our racial class, able-bodied or otherwise positionality, right? And like I said, this is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure that we can come up with, many more things that trans people encounter on the daily, right? So how do we sort of account for that, and how do we keep these 3 tiers of challenges in conversation with one another so that we are taking that sort of nuanced, complex, and intersectional approach, right, to trans people's lives on campus. So having said that, there is some good news. And you might know about this much more than I do, but I just want to point out some ways in which Colorado, state law has actually, tried to sort of address some of the things happening at the national level, right? Effective January 2024, gender neutral bathrooms in all new and renovating public buildings, right? They've mandated that there should be gender neutral bathrooms, right, in new buildings. So that's a big sort of development, and the changes are hopefully incumbent, right? SB 23-189 is a state bill that seeks to expand access to reproductive health care. So in my understanding, CU health plan apparently does not cover abortion, right? But the state does support it. And that is something that, I guess is an upshot, is a silver lining in the broader context of what is happening in the country right now, right? And CU also has extended fertility benefit to employees in 2022, from my understanding, which just FYI is not the case at Colorado College. So there's a lot of sort of, distress and conversation around that. Our health insurance policy is pretty exclusive or exclusionary when it comes to that. And then thirdly, the CU commitment I saw, as you all know better than I do, the president and the chancellors announced an unwavering commitment to DEI and admissions. I believe they use the word aggressive recruiting, which I love. I love those words. And aggressively recruiting minoritized populations, right? So these are some like I said, like silver lining, right, that we can expect to bear fruit soon. So with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about the strategies, right? What can we do in all of this sort of context? So just to sort of start off a little bit, like echoing the sort of framework that I started with, right? So it's a two-pronged sort of approach, right? One is that we have to change how we think, right? And our approach to things. And the other is that we have to like sort of convert it into action. We have to change our practices, right? So what does changing our approach entail? One that, trans people deserve justice and liberation and not just inclusion, right? And this can look like different things. And hopefully, again, when we discuss practices, we will understand better, right? What does just an inclusive approach mean? And what does it mean to sort of think about liberation for trans folks, justice for trans folks, right? And where is that? And how is that piece sort of connected to this idea of preempting, right? And prefiguring the university as a trans as a space where trans folks can, thrive, rather than just like a quick fix kind of approach, right? The second point is we need to hire trans people, and I'm going to echo the president and the chancellors, right? Aggressively hire trans people of color, right? So this idea that we need to put our money where our mouth is, right? That there is nobody who knows how to, if we want trans affirming universities, there's nobody else who knows how to affirm trans people than trans people themselves better, right? So to hire trans people of color as a priority, right? To move away from, and this is, like I said, echoing some of what I've said before, right? Moving away from a crisis intervention or reactive mode to one where we are trying to preempt and create conditions of livability, right? Before we even hire, right? Before we bring in a lot of people into systems that don't work for them, how can we sort of, solve for that and anticipate that? And as I said, moving away, refusing or moving away from our guard duties, right? How might we orient ourselves more towards support and service rather than this paranoid approach to trans people as, committing fraud? And this is, I was reading both the CC websites, right, around name changes on our ID cards, and so on and so forth. And I was looking at the CU site, and we tend to dedicate as much space in a single sort of web page, right? As much space to like, this is where you can go, if you have questions, or this is how the procedure can work for you. And the same amount of space but if you're trying to, if it is found that you are trying to defraud the system, there will be consequences, so on and so forth, right? we know that fraud is illegal, right? Trans people know that, and to sort of keep reminding us, right, lest we forget that our identities, our embodiment is always kind of suspicious and suspect, right? How can we change how our web pages look, right? From that to the questions that we ask, trans folks when they are trying to, access these services, change their names, change their gender, etc. The hurdles that we pose, right? You can't change your email before you change, your legal name, right? Those kinds of sort of disconnect that we create for trans folks, the risk that we pose to trans folks, right? Of outing them and of, misrecognizing them, etc., is very high when we pose these hurdles, right? I mean, Colorado law is even softer than and more inclusive in certain ways. It allows us to change our gender identification to X without on our Colorado state license, right? Before we've without producing any documentation for any kind of medical intervention and so on and so forth, which I find to be such a pleasant surprise as compared to some of the bizarre hurdles that I see at the university or college level, where it's like, no, you have to have all of these things worked out before we can change your email. I don't understand that, right? So how can we reduce the hurdles, right? How can, by moving away from these these sort of paranoid sort of imaginaries, right, that we participate in. The next point is a little hilarious that I should be saying that right now, but less parachuting of talent and expertise. Please put me out of my current job right now, right? I wish that instead of folks compensating folks and bringing in folks with expertise on the subject from outside of our university, our college, what have you, right? We actually amplify the in-house expertise and experience that we have in universities, because there are plenty, right? There's so many folks. I wish my college did that more. I've been asking for things, I've been theorizing things, I've been advocating for things related to trans life since I got to CC, and I don't know if I always feel seen and heard, right? But there is a tendency to bring people in, to bring expertise in this sort of event the limited space of an event, and then for us to leave and we don't really know what's happening then afterwards, right? And so how do we create and build relationships with the trans folks, especially trans folks of color who are already on our universities, right? And we build structures therefore of conversation, of accountability to them, that can help us actually bring about change, right? So less parachuting, right? And understanding that trans is not a new issue. Like, transness is not a new identity, it's not a new issue, right? Often, and it's not, and very importantly in the university context, it's not just a student only issue. And I say this especially as, I understand that I'm coming from the context of a liberal arts college where there's a lot of focus on student-centered services, right? But I do see this as something across multiple universities. There is a way in which we think about, trans identity as a whole, non-binary identity, gender non-conforming folks as just being young, and this whole issue of trans people as being new, right? And what that does is actually reduce buy-in, and it creates sort of like a generational discourse around trans and non-binary identities, right? So we are in the process, we are literally absenting, disappearing, right? Trans faculty and staff who have existed and do continue to exist and face some similar problems to students, but also other kinds of problems that we don't get to ever because we are, thinking of trans as a student-related issue. But also there is a way in which some, older faculty, older staff, right, will just sort of push this sort of whole issue aside as like a generational thing that they don't need to engage with, right? Because they have perhaps never confronted that their own colleagues have been queer, trans, so on and so forth, right? And that maybe there needs to be some rethinking both of curriculum and demeanor and like the pronoun question and so on and so forth. So how to create buy-in, right, from some across sort of generation, across demographics, right, in the university by thinking of trans as not a new phenomenon, right? But trans folks have existed for a while. We've been advocating for a while, and trans folks exist, you know, in our 40s as well. So, and beyond, right? And then lastly, to bring us back to this idea that, you know, if we are to position or think of ourselves as allies, we need to divest from this sort of understanding of the trans issue, quote unquote, as too complicated, as always an expert, a specialized issue that we cannot enter without offending people, we cannot enter because we don't know anything, so on and so forth, right? So how to, again, sort of keep in mind complexities and nuances without you know, thinking of it as unapproachably too complicated, and then therefore sort of wash our hands of the responsibility of doing anything, right, at from where we are located, whether we are cis, trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming, what have you, right? So that is kind of what I have to say about like how we might think about changing our approach. And then I have some thoughts about how we might change our practices, right, as well. So to double up, right, first and foremost, we need to hire more trans folks of color. And I say that specifically because often diversity initiatives in hiring, right, work through the rule of one. You can only have one type of, there's only like one type of difference allowed, right? So inevitably, we see how this results in the disproportionate absenting of trans women of color from academia, right? If you look around, you see how many trans people are on campus. I am pretty sure, you know, a whopping majority of those folks are trans men, right? Or trans masculine folks, and white trans masculine folks, right? So what is that about, and how can we sort of not just think about sort of, again, sort of like a single issue, right? Like a single lens kind of approach to hiring, but think about a richer approach, a more justice-oriented approach, right? So, and hire trans people of color to lead us, to guide us in precisely these kinds of initiatives, right? I'm gonna sort of skip to a later point that I make right here. I don't know if you can see the cursor, but you know, to compensate trans experts within the university. So again, what if, you know, what would it look like to amplify the voices of trans people who already exist on our campus, right? What does that do for our, you know, first for folks to be compensated for the emotional, intellectual, advocacy labor that they're already doing, right? It's only ethical that we compensate and we recognize that labor as labor, right? So we start compensating folks that already exists on campus, right? But also it increases visibility of trans folks and trans issues on campus, right? It gives us opportunities to build relationships within faculty and staff, right? If this same event was being led by, you know, a CU colleague, right? This would, I mean, I'm sure it's a pretty unique opportunity for like 50 odd folks, right, who are both faculty and staff to get together in a space like this and have this conversation, right? So, so compensating trans folks, recognizing their labor, right, and using it to sort of build these bridges that otherwise stay sort of pretty siloed, right? These conversations that are pretty siloed across different sort of academic units. So to go back to, you know, the second point is, you know, this idea or this reality rather that I was talking about earlier of this like fragmented support, right? What would it look like for there to be more synergy between and among admin units, right? Do we, and is that something that can happen without, you know, upper administration getting involved? Like, what would it mean for different stakeholders to just, you know, take initiative and to meet and say, how can we triangulate? What would it mean, right? To you know, for the HR office to talk to IT, and for those, you know, that those name change decisions or whatever to be reflected immediately in our sort of, you know, email or our whatever public presence, right, through IT. What would that look like, you know, with campus mail, for instance, or more very importantly, like healthcare and insurance, right? This is this is something that I experienced very recently, actually, at my institution, right? That it's so difficult for all of these different admin units to speak together. There's no sort of one-stop shop for trans so for trans people, and so we're just sort of bounced from one office to another. And so what would it mean, again, in order to prefigure a world where trans people can thrive? What would it mean for these academic units to take initiative and talk amongst each other about and make those sort of connections, right? One suggestion I would love to see at any university, and I've had a little bit of experience with that because I graduated years ago from the University of Minnesota, where they had this coordinated body, right, of different stakeholders from different administrative units, faculty, staff, but also community members, right? It currently goes by, I believe, the Trans Advisory and Action Team, it's called. So TAAT at the University of Minnesota, as just like a template, a way to think about how to, have collaborative initiatives around advocacy, around, greater access, and really like as a lobbying body, right, at the university, right? So instituting a coordinated sort of, like an effort, right? Collecting data, right? As sort of an obvious follow-up of what I said earlier. So yes, like perhaps we need upper administration to invest in like a university-wide effort, right, to collect data, demographic data around LGBTQ folks in general. But what would it look like to start that at a smaller level, right? Even at departmental levels or individual academic units, right? Perhaps JEDI could start, right? Something like, who are we serving? Who is part of our community? So smaller efforts that can then be, and I'm absolutely not a data person. I really don't know how it works, but I can imagine that if a lot of units, do smaller scale data collection, that maybe that can also be aggregated, and we can understand sort of like a broader story from there, right? And of course, very importantly, then we'll get a picture of how many folks are we retaining. What is the retention number looking like, right, of trans folks? Because it's one thing to recruit and grant admission and hire, but it's another thing, right, for us to be able to create that community and that space in a longer lasting, sustainable way for trans folks, right, and non-binary folks. So collecting data. Removing, as I said, removing small hurdles, right, in name and pronoun change, these sort of discrepancies or these ways in which we expect trans folks to always have figured out our legal name change before we will change any other kind of identification within the university, so on and so forth. So removing some of those hurdles. I have seen that and I've heard from some colleagues in the CU system, right, that is more of an issue there, whereas I happen to have gotten lucky at my institution where my chosen name and pronouns were sort of on my official IDs from the get-go, and my legal name change happened actually just this year, so 6 years later, right? And there were some struggles in there, but I know that it is possible to figure that out. So how can we sort of remove those hurdles, right? I've talked about the compensation, of trans experts within our universities, or non-binary experts, so on and so forth. But also creating learning tools for faculty and admin. So of course, events like this, but also creating sort of maybe a compendium of videos, right, visual aids, other kinds of, infographics, what have you, just equipping faculty and staff with that information, and not only focusing again on only students as the folks who need to be educated, right, on some of these practices and so on and so forth. And then right, so listing more resources, right, on our various sort of websites. So I know that, and I see both at CU and at my institution, how, there are links to, healthcare and maybe even housing, right? And other sorts of things. But what would it look like for us to, post links to the, campus run food pantry, right? A closet, like a trans-specific, trans-affirming, gender non-conforming closet that maybe the Pride Center can run, and so on and so forth, right? In other words, what would it look like to also acknowledge and to destigmatize some of these quote-unquote basic needs, right? To acknowledge that like trans folks are really living, a lot of trans folks of color are living very precarious lives, right? We know that the numbers of trans and gender non-conforming houses folks is increasing, right? So different kinds of precarities, even within the student, staff, and faculty body. And so, the more that we can destigmatize those kinds of resources and have them be easily available, that would be wonderful, right? And then collaborating with local communities, right? Breaking that sort of the sort of distinction and the siloing between academia and whatever's out there in the community, right? The ivory tower and the streets sort of dichotomies that we live in. So what would it mean again to take leadership from trans folks in nonprofits, community members, artists, right? Not only within our curriculum, but also precisely for initiatives that will help us navigate healthcare or what have you, right? So what would it look like to collaborate and compensate, local talent? By local, I mean outside of the university, but in the community, right? And that would also, of course, we keep saying strength in numbers, and that's where the numbers might come from, right? So how do we create sort of just like a broader approach, right, to trans issues on campus. So those are some strategies that I wanted to put out there, and I don't know how we're doing, but with time, exactly how much time we have.
So we have about 6 minutes left, and I do want to leave some time for Q&A, but if there's anything that you want to cover before we head to Q&A, please do so.
Well, I don't know. I guess I'll just put this question out there, and folks can do that on their own time, right? But the idea was to think collectively, or maybe in groups, right, in breakout groups, about first, like, contributing one concrete strategy to this list or action point, right? Even if it doesn't call itself strategy or whatever, but to contribute an action point, and then to think together about coming up with like 3 actionable steps towards actually implementing one of these strategies in this academic year, right? Like, how can we break some of these things down from where we are located and actually see, make them come alive, was kind of the thing that I was going to leave with. But if we don't have time for that, I'm happy to take questions. And yeah.
We can do like a quick, kind of like what we did with the that first question that you gave for us, and just have people put things in the chat, or feel free to speak up, to take yourselves off mute, in relation to the discussion question for a couple of minutes, and then we can go into questions.
I also wanted to point out 2 resources, just in case folks are noticing the chat. There's one resource that was created by our student programming coordinator, Lila, that has resources on how to support trans people on campus, off campus, what resources are available on campus, off campus. And then the other piece I included was transitioning at CU Boulder. And if anyone else wants to include any resources that you may know about that we're not aware of, please do use the chat. But again, we want to offer opportunities to ask questions. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you all. Ermi and I will be looking for questions in the chat, and also anyone else who may be interested in raising their hand.
Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat, or one question in the chat right now. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and strategies. To the point about hiring trans people of color, yes, 100%. Do you have suggestions on language and or job boards to post to, or more intentionally recruit trans people of color?
So one, let me just try to address that. I can't promise that it'll be a good answer, but I think it's about who we are targeting, but it's also about what kinds of information we are putting in our job ad that will indicate to trans folks of color, etc., that they are important, that they are seen, that they are part of the pool that we are considering, right? So so to me, it's about how we use the language, but it's also like what kinds of resources or information, right, do we want our target audience to know about, so that they know that this is a welcoming space, right? So like, I mean, I'm thinking about some of the resources that folks have put right here, right? What if those were to be included in our job posts, and that already indicates that we are really committed. We're thinking about you, we're committed to your safety, we're committed to your health, we're committed to you having a smooth experience here, and we are sort of preempting that you will need these resources. I know that if that were to happen in a job post that I'm looking at, I would immediately know this is okay. They want me there. So I don't know if that helps, but yeah, that's what I can think of right now.
A private question that I got is, why is it that we don't require pronouns or for people to have preferred names when they apply for jobs, or just in general, why is it that we don't have pronouns required? And then the other piece is, when people are applying for jobs, why is it that we don't offer the opportunity to have their preferred names right from the start?
That's a great question. Yeah, I have the same question, honestly. Why don't we, right? It seems like an easy fix. And also, in our interviewing processes, like, can we institute, right, that everybody introduces themselves, and uses pronouns and so on. If you notice, right, like, I haven't put my pronouns in my Zoom name or whatever it is, right? And that's because I'm tired of being the only one often, and therefore outing myself, because that's how it works, right? People see pronouns and they think that we have pronouns to confess or something, as opposed to others who don't have pronouns to confess, right? And so if more people started doing it, trans folks would probably feel, obviously, like, find it easier to talk about their pronouns as well, right? So it's not only about pronouns and names, though. It is also how we use all gender language, in hiring or in other contexts as well. I would also like to just offer very quickly that I prefer the language of chosen name rather than preferred name. I see that a lot on CU websites, and I don't know all of the, I mean, I'm sure that, or rather I hope that it was in consultation with trans folks, in the trans community at CU, but and maybe this is just a personal thing, but preferred makes it sound like I'm rifling through a number of names and pronouns every other day, which more power to folks, and that should be fine as well. But chosen feels closer to right, how a lot of us kind of think about and our relationship to our name, right, that we're using day in and day out, and what we want folks to call us. So just wanted to offer that. And yeah, any other questions?
So what we're seeing is a lot of resources in the chat. Please do keep them coming. Marisha and I will follow up with an email where we will include the link of today's conversation. We will also include an email where you can reach Dr. Kumar if you're interested in having something similar like this for your department or your space or organization. And we will also include all the phenomenal resources that have been shared in this chat as well. Before we let you all go, one, we want to thank Dr. Kumar, and we will also invite you all to stay afterwards if you want, where we will turn off the camera. If there's questions you want to just have, or even just personal gratitude that you want to share in this space. And then before we let you all go, we did a poll at the beginning. We want to end this with just one question again with the poll. So 2 questions, sorry. So if you can please take a few minutes to do the poll, we will appreciate your support with this.
Could I say one last thing, actually?
Yes.
I just wanted to, thank you. I just wanted to shout out a colleague at CU Boulder, I believe, that I spoke with, who really has inspired some of the things that I've put in my PowerPoint today. Aisha Namari. Thank you, Marisha, for putting me in touch with them. Thank you, Aisha, for your expertise, really. I really hope that your voice can be amplified more, that you can reach more folks, because you have a wealth of knowledge. You've done things on campus that really deserve a lot more recognition than it probably currently gets. So thank you for your time, for meeting me, and thank you everyone for participating. I have a little slide saying that, so maybe I should be. There we go. Thank you for participating. It was great to hang out for a bit with you all.
Thank you so much for that. And yes, for those of you who have not met Aisha, Aisha has been a partner with our office for 2 years now, and has helped us figure out how do we better have these conversations, including who we bring to these spaces and how we do this work. So thank you for giving Aisha a shout out. Thank you, Aisha, for always continuing to do the work, even though, again, this is not a part of Aisha's job. And so just want to remind folks, how can I take some responsibility, even if it's not in my job description? It's something that we hope you feel empowered to do after today's conversation as well. So we're going to share the results, and just want to highlight, thank you those who are being honest, right? For those of you who found the information helpful, we can see that most of you strongly agree. And then there's that bottom bit where how can you rate your understanding in comparison to the first poll. We can see that 69% of folks more likely agree that there's a higher level of understanding after today's conversation with Dr. Kumar. So thank you again for your knowledge, for just sharing this space with us. So we're going to go ahead and stop sharing the screen. So